Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jack Morton Auditorium at George Washington University. Thank you for coming to today's program, A Global Trade Agenda for the 45th President. My name is Reed Click, and I am the Faculty Director of the George Washington Center for International Business Education and Research, the GW-CIBER, which is the local host for today's event. We have two splendid panels for the program today, and we would not have been able to put them together without our partner, the Association of Women in International Trade, or WIIT. The president of WIIT is the moderator of our first panel. I am very pleased to introduce to you Evelyn Suarez, the president of WIIT and the founder of the Suarez firm, a customs and international trade law and consulting firm. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Suarez.
Thank you. Thank you, Reed. Thank you for hosting this event. On behalf of the Association of Women in International Trade and also George Washington University Center for International Business Education and Research, as well as the District Export Council for Virginia and DC, welcome to a global trade agenda for the 45th president. While trade has become a little bit of a hot button issue during this presidential cycle, trade is here to stay one way or the other, whoever gets elected. So we decided to take a deeper dive and look at international trade. So our first panel will examine why trade matters from various perspectives. We will have Ambassador Vedder and Minister Suzuki talk about the macroeconomic benefits of trade, while we have Mr. Capozzi, who is with Virginia International Terminals, an arm of the Port of Virginia, a major port on the East Coast. He'll talk about how trade matters to that port and to that port community and the Commonwealth of Virginia. And finally, last but not least, we have Julie Stitzel with Etsy. Julie will address the opportunities that international commerce has created for small business entrepreneurs who use Etsy's platform. I think you'll find it interesting to learn about trade in general, but also about the port and Etsy itself. So that's our first panel. As to the second panel, we've noted that not all is necessarily well with trade. Many claim that they have been left behind, and trade, unfortunately, has been identified or blamed as the culprit. There's a growing recognition that there's something at play that has hindered job growth, but is it trade? So we decided to assemble our second panel, and that is what needs to be fixed. That's our topic for our second panel. So this is the way we will proceed. I will introduce the speakers on our first panel. In the interest of time, I'm not going to recite their bios. After we go through this panel and this discussion, Reed will introduce Kathryn Hauser, who will moderate the second panel. So let me tell you a little bit about our speakers. Okay, Ambassador Darci Vedder serves as Chief Agricultural Negotiator with the rank of Ambassador at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. She's responsible for bilateral and multilateral negotiations and policy coordination regarding agricultural trade. Then we welcome Minister Kazuhiro Suzuki. Minister Suzuki has served as Minister for Economic Affairs at the Embassy of Japan since September 16th, 2016. So welcome to Washington. He began his career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan in 1986. Next to Minister Suzuki, we have Tom Capozzi. And Tom is the Chief Sales Officer of the Virginia International Terminals, where he is responsible for managing and coordinating the Port of Virginia's global commercial business activity. If you haven't been down there to see the Port of Virginia, you should see it. It's quite a big port. And then we have Julie Stitzel. Julie is Senior Manager for Federal Advocacy and Policy at Etsy. Her work focuses on advocating for Etsy's sellers by advancing policies that strengthen micro businesses and increase access to the global marketplace through technology. I'm eager to hear about Etsy. I'm always learn a little bit more about it. So let's start with Ambassador Vetter. Ambassador Vetter, what do you think the American public needs to know about trade in general and TPP in particular?
Well, I think that the American public experiences the benefits of trade every day, but doesn't think about it very often. Trade matters to producers and to consumers and to all of us as Americans in thinking about our place in the larger global community. And TPP is a way that we advance all of those relationships. You know, producers are always looking for a new customer base to serve, ways to improve their products, to find new technologies, inputs, and services that will allow them to do business better. And good trade policy can help them get access to those inputs, but also to reduce the risk and the cost of doing business overseas. And that's what we try to do through our trade agreements. For consumers, there's probably not a single person in this audience who isn't wearing a piece of clothing that might have come from overseas, or you are using your cell phones that might have been assembled or have parts that were from both the United States and many other countries. And so the benefits to consumers are vast in terms of the choice, the quality, the variety, and the affordability of the goods and services that we take for granted every day. And trade relationships are a key part of our foreign policy. And we shouldn't forget that those countries with whom we have the strongest economic ties also tend to be our allies on the world stage. And we can align politically as well. You certainly don't want to have a conflict with folks with whom you are economically intertwined. And that takes us to TPP, which is an opportunity for us to further integrate our economies with 12 Asia-Pacific nations in one of the most dynamic regions of the world, both economically and politically. And the agreement is particularly important for a few reasons. One is what's in it, and that's everything. TPP countries vowed to liberalize or to free up trade in some way, some fashion or another, every single good. And that's rare in a trade agreement, and it's particularly rare in my area of focus, which is agriculture. But those 12 countries decided that they would put every product on the table and create new market access for it in some way. In agriculture, that means that our colleagues from Japan put 6 sacred products on the table. Beef, pork, dairy, wheat, rice, sugar, have excluded them from every previous free trade agreement. Canada provided access for dairy, poultry, and eggs, something they had never done. And they did it because there were 11 other nations at the table who were willing to do the same and who were also willing to commit to the highest standards in a free trade agreement ever. So the strongest rules on intellectual property protection, strong rules on e-commerce, something that really brings this agreement up to date with the modern economy that we live in. First ever rules on state-owned enterprises and making sure that our businesses can compete on a level playing field with state-owned enterprises in other countries. And so the benefit of having 12 dynamic economies integrate themselves so fully gave them the leverage and the ability to put everything on the table. And so the agreement itself and its structure is important. So that's what's in it. Then there's who's in it. And from an agriculture perspective in particular, you have 2 high-value, high-income economies with new market access in Canada and Japan. Again, access to goods we've never been able to get access to before. But then you have Malaysia and Vietnam, some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and they're growing populations and a growing percentage of those populations that are joining the middle class, which means they're going to start demanding a whole new variety of goods and new volumes of goods. And, I negotiate the agricultural provisions, and so we think of people joining the middle class, the first things people do is they change the way they eat. they don't have to worry about enough calories. They start thinking about the quality of those calories. And so they move from purchasing basic inputs to higher protein, higher value products. The United States is a major exporter of dairy, meat, and poultry. All of those, we think, will grow in demand. And they're going to want fresh fruits and vegetables to improve their nutrition, another area where we excel. So we see that Southeast Asia region in particular as places where we can expand volume, value, and variety. And that's not just true in agriculture, but in a variety of other consumer goods that we export, that our colleagues in other countries export as well. And that trade will balance amongst each other. And then there are these, the higher standards in the agreement. I mentioned intellectual property, labor and environment standards. Countries have to pledge to meet certain standards of labor protections and environmental protection to be part of the TPP club. So we're using TPP to shape globalization and to, in effect, address some of the concerns about trade moving toward a lowest common denominator. In fact, through TPP, we create an incentive for good behavior because in order to be part of that TPP club, you have to meet these certain standards. But the benefits are access to these very vibrant economies. And the third issue is foreign policy. The Southeast Asian region, the Asia Pacific, is a region with a number of things happening politically as well as economically. Certainly, if you look at the rise of China and what it is doing to exert its influence in the region, there are reasons why. Some of those countries want to show a strong economic partnership and a stronger alliance with the United States and with the 12 nations of the TPP. And one way we can foster that alliance is, of course, through becoming more economically integrated. On the flip side, if we fail to get TPP through our Congress enacted by those countries, then we really cede an opportunity to show leadership and to influence both the rules of trade, but also our stronger political alliances as well. So in a nutshell, that's why trade matters for producers, for consumers, and for the United States' position in the world.
Thank you, Ambassador Vetter. It's I think very informative. I think many people don't realize how much rule of law is included in TPP and what an advancement it would be in terms of a trade agreement. Minister Suzuki, what message would you send the next? What message would Japan like to send the next administration on why trade matters?
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Suarez, and thank you also, Ambassador Vetter, for explaining thoroughly about the significance of the TPP. I'm very much relieved that I don't have to do that. So, I mean, her explanation is very, very authentic, so I really trust what she said is very true. So I really try to say your question from the different perspective. As I've been introduced, I got into the foreign ministry in 1986. So I spent my career as a diplomat for 30 years. And among those 30 years of my career, I spent 10 years for the U.S.-Japan relationship. And every time I did trade issues with the United States, I was in a transition period of the U.S. government. First, that was 1992 to 1994. It was from the senior Bush to Bill Clinton. The second time was 2000 to 2002. That was from Bill Clinton to Junior George W. Bush, and this time around. And then I really feel the differences each time I came to this post and then this post here in Washington, D.C. I think the mutual perception of the United States, both the United States and Japan, is really improving, and our relationship never been better today. Let's just give you one example. The data. Last year, the Pew Research conducted a survey in the United States. 68% of Americans believe that Japan is trusted and most important country. And in Japan, 75% of Japanese now believe that U.S. is trusted and very important country. But those figures are quite different in the past. In 1993, when I was working as a trade officer, Pew also conducted similar researches, but the question is different. The question was, is Japan a fair trade partner? In those days, 1993, 72% of Americans believe that Japan is not a fair trade partner. Only 14% believe Japan is a fair trade partner. Last year, the same research survey was conducted, and last year's result, 24% of Americans believe that Japan is not fair, but over 55% of Americans think that Japan is a fair trade partner. So the perception is really now improving, and I think there are reasons behind. Background to this is the trade and investment. And then I believe that trade and investment are mutually enhancing. This is empirical economic history. If you look at the British Empire, if you look at the miracle of East Asia, if you look at the miracle of ASEAN, trade goes together with investment. And that's the reason why the two economies, US economy and Japanese economies, are so integrated together. And now that we have a much better economic development for mutually beneficial. Let me give you some example on this. Today, Japanese-owned affiliates in the United States employ more than 800,000 Americans. USA Today on July 1st, there's a very interesting article utilizing Cars.com America Made Index. And in that index, the ratio of the domestic part, the domestically gathered part being utilized, and they put domestic content ratio, that's what you say, been indicated. And they put, if the domestic ratio is more than 75%, they think it as American product. On the car list, number one most popular car is Toyota Camry, made in Georgetown, Kentucky. That's 75%. Number 2, Honda Accord. Number 3, Toyota Sienna. Number 4, Honda Odyssey. Number 5, Honda Pilot. And then goes Chevy Traverse, GMC Al-Qaeda, Buick Enclave. Even the Honda Accord, 80% is made in the United States. So I believe those are the American products, but with the Japanese brand names. So those are the reality in between Japan and the United States now. So if you know those facts, I'm a little bit concerned about the current campaigning in the United States, although I have to be a neutral as a diplomat, but for both candidates indicated negative views on the trade and TPPs, and there's sort of a trend that for the inward-looking trend in the United States, and the anti-trade sentiment is rampant in both the presidential and the congressional campaigns. So those are the worries that I myself, and I think the Japanese people and Japanese government has. The problem is that fact is not believed or not even known. How much people in the United States know about TPP, for example? There was a survey conducted by Politico and Harvard University in September. 29% of Americans answered that they have heard TPP, only 29%. Of these 29% Americans, 61% thought China was the TPP participant or didn't know the answer. Only 11% of the American of the surveyed answered correctly that China is not the member of the TPP. So we need to go back to the basic fact. U.S. overall export of goods and services create 11.7 million jobs in America. U.S. exports of goods and services to 11 other TPP countries alone create 4.2 million jobs for Americans. 1/3 of the U.S. growth today for the last 5 years has been driven by the U.S. export. TPP country accounts for 45% of total U.S. goods export. And as a result of TPP, over 18,000 tariffs for the U.S. export will be eliminated. And in our case, in Japanese case, most of the custom duties will be eliminated either immediately or through the staging. So there will be more and more access to the American products, American manufactured product, American agriculture product to the Japanese market and vice versa. So I believe the TPP will be the great benefit to all the participating countries, and because of this belief that the Japanese government is working very hard to pass our TPP bill in our diet. So in terms of the message for the next administration, I think our message is clear, and it is not only for the next administration, but also the current administration as well, that I hope that the U.S. should reassure and maintain its open and free trade policy and regime. And we are very much, we trust and convinced that the U.S. Congress and the American people realize the significance of the trade and the importance of TPP. And that's really the clear message that I think our government and myself would really carry to the current administration as well as to the next administration.
Well, thank you, Minister Suzuki. I think it's very appropriate to reflect on the relationship between the United States and Japan over decades and how perceptions have changed with more trade and investment. And it certainly, I think it was very informative to focus on the jobs that have been created by that investment. So I want to turn to Mr. Capozzi. Tom, I have very fond of the Port of Virginia. To tell us a little bit about how trade, how trade affects a port community, how it supports a community, and but I think it would be good if Tom could tell us a little bit about the Port of Virginia. I think many people don't know much about it. It's a very large port. New York, New Jersey, of course, is a very big one, and so people tend to know about Savannah and Charleston. They sometimes look to Baltimore, but they sometimes overlook Virginia. Mm-hmm. But it's a major port. And so tell us a little bit about the port, and also so that people can understand the magnitude of your operations, but also tell us how trade impacts the port, the state, and the region.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn. Well, the port, if you look at history, ports have been a tremendous generator of wealth and power for the localities that have hosted the ports. And in Virginia, Virginia's a state or a commonwealth that has relied very heavily on defense spending for many decades. As that is declining, Governor McAuliffe has initiated some efforts to try to diversify Virginia's economy. And one of the pillars upon which he's trying to build that is the Port of Virginia. We feel, and the Port of Virginia, just to tell a little bit about us, we are the third largest port on the East Coast, behind New York and Savannah. We're the sixth largest in North America. We handle about 2.5 million TEUs, which is a 20-foot equivalent unit. That's kind of the container measurement that our industry uses per year. We're about a $500 million company as far as the revenue that we generate. And when you look at our direct employment, we employ about 650 employees directly between the Port Authority and our terminal operation. We also employ about 2,000 international longshoremen laborers. When you look at the impact of the port on the Commonwealth or the localities and Hampton Roads, it really is tremendous, and it's a growing impact. We have over 700 international companies in the Commonwealth that do business through the Port of Virginia. Annually, in excess of $2 billion in investment is made by international companies, again, that in the Commonwealth that use the Port of Virginia. So and really virtually everything that we touch, everything that we do on a daily basis at the port involves international trade. We handle very little domestic, what we would call domestic freight. All of our customers, our direct customers, the ocean carriers or shipping lines, are all foreign-owned entities. There are virtually no U.S. flag independent-owned companies any longer. So international trade is tremendously important to us as a port and the future. And I think we're directly linked and a growing influence with the Commonwealth and its future economy.
Yeah, I think Virginia has recognized the importance of trade, and I thought there was some legislation passed to create an Office of International Trade. Is that correct? Something that's coming about recently?
Yes, there was previously, the International Trade Group was housed within Virginia Economic Development Partnership that had the focus of drawing foreign investment, and then you had a trade group that was a piece of that entity that was focused on largely helping Virginia companies export their product overseas. What this most recent legislation did was actually break that group out to form an independent entity that would be solely focused on trade, and not only in helping Virginia companies export, but also to help them import raw materials and sourcing to become more effective in those areas. Anything that they can do to help that company become more effective or more efficient. So I think that's been a great move, and it's in the process of being developed right now, but it's certainly an outfit that me and my group in selling the port will work with hand in hand to draw more cargo moving over the port.
That's excellent. Okay, let's turn to Julie. I think she's the new wave of trade with digital trade and e-commerce. Please tell us a little bit about Etsy and tell us about what types of businesses utilize Etsy, and tell us about the importance of international markets for Etsy sellers.
Yeah, I kind of want to volley this to you, Tom, because when we were backstage, he said, "Oh, Etsy, my daughter's a fan, and you show up on my credit card statement quite a bit." So I'm sure Tom knows how Etsy works, but just out of curiosity, how many people are familiar with Etsy? Oh, quite a bit. Are there any Etsy sellers in the room? Not yet. So we are an online marketplace that started in 2005. Our mission is to reimagine commerce in ways that build a more lasting and fulfilling world. We have 1.7 million sellers around the globe, located in just about every country, that sell anything from food to furniture. Last year, our sellers sold $2.39 billion worth of goods using our platform. How it works from a buyer side seems like lots of folks are familiar. I just bought a wreath yesterday. You go onto the site. Well, first you say, I really want to find something cool. I think I'll go to Etsy. And then you go on the site and find some really cool options and buy whatever it is you're looking for. It's shipped, it's sent to you, and usually with a nice friendly note from a micro business entrepreneur. About our 1.7 million sellers in the U.S., 86% of them are women, and most of them are businesses of one. So they are operating their shops out of their homes. Some have studios. And like I said, they sell anything from food to furniture. The reason why trade is important to us is because, much like the ambassador said earlier, the minute that a seller opens up an Etsy shop, they immediately have the potential to become an exporter, because we have 26 million buyers around the globe. So for the price of internet access and 20 cents, you can list an item on Etsy and have access to this global marketplace. So trade touches our work. But I'd say that there are some pain points for our sellers along the way, because they are businesses of one. And just to step back a little bit and to provide a little more context. So as they're working out of their homes, our research shows they spend about 50% of their time making and another 50% of their time on business administration. So why we look at trade, why we're focusing on trade, is to do anything that we can to mitigate the administrative side, to ease those pain points when you're doing cross-border shipping or international sales. And our last quarter showed that actually we do quite a bit of international transactions. About 30.3% of our gross merchandise sales was a result of a transaction that took place where an Etsy seller or an Etsy buyer was outside of the U.S. So it's an interesting topic for us, but also for our sellers.
Do you think your sellers realize that international commerce is important to their business, that expands their opportunity?
Well, I think it's really practical. I mean, if we could just for a second put ourselves in an Etsy seller's shoes. So they are in, and actually it's a good point, because how Etsy works is important, but why Etsy works is probably more important. And the reason, one of the big reasons Etsy works is because of the internet. So it democratizes entrepreneurship for Etsy sellers. And regardless of where she's located, rural Arkansas, New York City, the minute that they get a sale, while they might be thinking it's going to be their friends or their family because they've said, oh, I'm going to open up an Etsy shop, it could very well be someone from Berlin. And the minute that they get that sale, they're excited, but then the clock starts ticking. And they need to figure out how to get their product from A to B, and that's where access to information, transparency in shipping, making sure that you can track your package, all of that stuff directly impacts our sellers. So while they might not look at it a lens from TPP, first trade agreement that has an SME chapter, which is fantastic, they do very much feel the practical implications and the pain points when they're trying to get their products to their customers.
Well, I'm going to go back to Ambassador Vetter, and you've been traveling around the country talking about TPP and trying to educate people. I mean, Minister Suzuki mentioned that there's a need for more information on the benefits of trade. Why do you think trade has become so controversial or become such a hot button?
Well, I think, generally that when someone needs something to point to, sometimes that trade agreement, that piece of paper, becomes the place to address your angst. And there are economic problems in this country. There has been wage stagnation. The economy has not rebounded as quickly as we hoped that it would after this Great Recession. And everyone knows that trade is happening, that globalization is happening, and that it's not as easy to understand those buyer-seller relationships anymore. Or it's not as easy to know who is your customer, where your products go, because global supply chains are incredibly integrated. You know, as I mentioned earlier, your cell phone might have parts from many different countries and be assembled in yet another place. And so it's hard to say what's the cause and effect. And so I think it's tempting to say, you know, if we just didn't pass this one trade agreement, or if we just tried to redo those pieces of paper, somehow all of those relationships would stop. We could go back to relationships that are simpler or easier to understand. But that's just not the case. The genie won't go back in the bottle, and globalization itself has been happening for centuries. And, you know, businesses will look for new places to do business, ways to improve their product, ways to decrease their costs. That will keep happening. What we need to do is use the opportunity to form alliances and agreements that allow us to shape how that happens, and to create an incentive to do more business with other countries who are willing to meet the same standards that we expect. And so when I go out and I talk to farmers and ranchers and food processors and everyone in the ag sector around the country, I say it's great that you're going to export more pork or more poultry or, you know, more wheat or rice, but what you're really exporting is the way that you do business. And one of the reasons people like to do business with the United States is because we're transparent. We have good infrastructure, and we deliver what we say we're going to deliver on time and according to specifications, and we value forming these relationships, and we value openness. Our economy is relatively open. many of the other TPP countries are going to have to reduce much higher tariffs and to change a lot of their laws to protect innovation and intellectual property, to bring their labor and environmental standards up to levels that we expect. And so we have an opportunity to shape how people trade, not just what is traded, by using these agreements as an incentive that you can do more business with us, that you can integrate with these countries, but only if you do so in a way that respects our expectations and our values. And so, I think the agreement itself is easy to scapegoat, but it's important to look at why we do it. And why we do it is precisely to help address some of that underlying angst that has put trade in the spotlight.
It's amazing. I was just in Brazil, and I was meeting with a number of companies that they want to stand up against corruption and they want to commit themselves to compliance, customs compliance, international trade compliance. Mm-hmm. And there were many presentations made by the companies, and it was interesting to see the influence of the U.S. approach to rule of law compliance. So it's something that it just came to life for me. I see it much more hypothetically, and it was very interesting. So, well, this is good work, obviously. I congratulate you. I know it's hard work.
You raise an issue, if I might, that I think Brazil is a good case in point. That I was just in Brazil in July, and every business group I met with talked about the Brazil cost of doing business because of the lack of transparency and because, frankly, they have not been forging trade agreements with their partners.
Right.
They are being left behind. And frankly, that's a choice we face here with TPP as well. Our trading partners are out there actively negotiating with one another. They're forming these agreements, they are reducing their tariffs, they're integrating their economies. And we made a really strategic bet to say, let's take the 12 countries that are willing to integrate the most, to meet the highest standards, to make sure every product is on the table. Let's integrate those economies, and then let's ask others, once TPP is up and running, to join that model so we can influence really how the region trades as a whole. But if we don't do that, our TPP partners and others in the region aren't going to stop their negotiations and wait for us. They will integrate without us and give each other preferential access that we won't enjoy. And we've seen that happen in the bilateral free trade agreement with Japan and Australia. It's having a big impact on our exporters of beef and other ag products. We see that happening with China and then the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that they have announced that they're speeding up their negotiations precisely because they see our TPP process taking longer than expected, and they'd like to create the model instead of us.
At WIIT, we've been doing a myth and a reality every week. It's been challenging, but one of the myths was that the world will wait and so we tried to dispel the myth with a reality. But anyhow, let me turn to Minister Suzuki again and talk about TPP and how important it is to the U.S.-Japan relationship.
Okay, well, the TPP is such a gigantic trade agreement. So it is really the great strategic architecture blueprint for the region. And then it is great for the networking of the 12 countries in the Pacific region. And it is really a great asset for all of us to connect each other, to those countries. So it is really strengthening our bilateral relationship in the larger context. So that's really the strategic importance of the TPP, and it would really solidify our alliance with the United States. I think that's the salient point of what the importance for our alliance. But let me add two things. After hearing your conversation, one thing. This is a bit of anecdote about U.S., Japan, Australia free trade. My wife, when she was in Japan, in Tokyo, after the effectuation of the FTA between Japan and Australia, she always bought Aussie beef, not the U.S. beef. Why? Because it's cheaper. That's the market reality in Japan. And then so Aussie beef is really getting popular in Japan. and it's a really high quality. And I'm sure that the U.S. can compete with this, TPP if it's, passed to both the parliament. Number two, you mentioned about the rule of law. I think that's also very important. I was the ambassador to Ethiopia before I arrived here, and I had a bit of experience on that issues. In Ethiopia, there's now a lot of construction and big economic growth, and then there's a lot of consumption of power cable. But they are using very cheap ones. It's just some of them are naked copper lines. Some of them are just very, very simple ones. So there's a lot of power leakage, but it's cheap. Mm-hmm. I think United States has a similar one, but some Japanese company has a really low leakage power line, but it's very, very expensive. But over the period of 20 years, 30 years, because of the durability and because of the low leakage rate, it will compensate and it becomes cheaper. And I had a very, very hard time to sell these products to the Ethiopian government, Ethiopian public sectors. And they need to know the data and they need to know all the details about it. But if you put something like a life cycle cost on those procurement rules, something like that, if things like that happens, that would really benefit for those advanced products to be penetrating in those developing countries' market. I think the architecture like a TPP is a really good base to start. If you look at Asia, Asia's infrastructure need is really, really huge. And there's lots of the building, constructions, and things like those going on. Procurement is really one of the really important rules in the Asia. If you look at the 10 years from now, 20 years from now, so the architecture like TPP will be one of the bases to improve our rules of law in the region. So I think from that perspective as well, there are importance of a trade and then to have a good trade agreement.
I'm going to ask both you and Ambassador Vetter to comment on TPP is an agreement with various countries at different levels of development. So it's a really unusual agreement. It's not just a multilateral. I mean, it's not just a bilateral or, it's a real. It reflects real progress. Do you see it as a proof of concept that countries of different levels of development can forge a high standard agreement? Maybe Darci, you want to go first?
Sure. Yes, I do. I think it's a game changer. I think it's really important to see that Vietnam and Japan and the United States are all taking on exactly the same commitments in TPP. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons. I think that if you look at the WTO and some of the problems we've had developing a multilateral approach, it has been because there was this feeling that developed countries would take on one set of commitments and developing countries weren't quite ready yet to do that, or that it was too far for them to go and they wouldn't see the benefits of doing this. And in fact, if you look at the economic analyses that have been done out there on who benefits from TPP, Vietnam is at the top every time. And it's because of both the opportunities they would have to build businesses and increase their exports, but also because signing on to the standards of TPP suddenly gives them the seal of approval to be an excellent place for investment, which Minister Suzuki had highlighted as being such an important part of the relationship. And so their economy really could be transformed by this. And so if we can move forward with TPP, I think we have a huge example in terms of how developing countries would look at trade and investment as a part of their overall development strategy and not something that competes with it. And the second reason I think it's such a game changer is because it comes with, I think, realistic expectations. So we're not asking countries to sign on and to these high standard agreements, knowing that for some of us, our current infrastructure and our current rules of law will allow us to easily implement and others won't. It comes with, in some cases, phase-in periods. It comes with capacity building, expertise, and investment of dollars to make sure that when countries sign on the line, they have the ability to succeed and to meet those standards and do it well. And that's common investment among the 12 countries to make sure that all countries both live up to the standards, but are successful in doing so in a way that allows the benefits to then accrue to them and make them full and equal parts of that TPP alliance. And so I think it's a good model, both in what it achieves, but how it goes about achieving it.
Well, you see, there's, of course, the economics of comparative advantage between the different level of development. So that's one thing. But you also, please look at dynamics, not in a static manner. That the projection in the future, the developing countries market will make a development, and maybe now that they just need a primitive medicine, but as their living standard improve, they now there's a more and more need for the cutting edge technology for the medical equipment and so on. So there will be expanding the market in the future as the economy grows, as the economy develops. So in the end, if you look at the future projection, there will be potentially larger and larger market for the TPP countries. So I think that's the reality.
Hey, Tom, I'd like to thank you, Minister Suzuki. I'd like to turn to you. And the Port of Virginia is gearing up. The Panama Canal has widened. Do the people in the port community, do they look to, what do they think about TPP and TTIP and all these things? Do they think about it? Do they talk about it? Do they see it as a good thing?
Well, I'll say the port community, the people that are involved in the port, yes. Certainly the Panama Canal is a big event for us. We're going to see much larger ships coming to the East Coast, where there was a restriction previously that limited the ships to about 5,000 TEU. Now we can handle ships up through the Panama Canal up to about 12,500. So that'll make the ports along the East Coast for that Asia trade more competitive for business vis-a-vis the West Coast ports. I think once you get beyond, though, the local community that's involved, the general public in the area doesn't really see it that as well, and that's something that we're working on to try to get the message out about the benefits, and not only of trade but of the port in general. But I think that's something that needs work, and people. In our business, we like to tell the story of down in Charleston, South Carolina. A few years back, they were trying to develop their new terminal on Daniel Island. And they were running into a lot of local public resistance. And they had these public meetings, and there's a gentleman gets up, and it's on tape, and he says, I don't know why we need these ports anyway. I can go down to Walmart and buy whatever I want. And that's just exemplifies, the challenge that you have there. So,
well, I suspect we have a lot of work to do, whether it's the government or educational institutions like GW or Old Dominion University. We'll have a professor from Old Dominion University on our second panel. So I guess we have our work cut out for us for the near-term future. Julie. What, you sort of alluded to it. What improvements in trade would benefit your sellers most? What are the issues that create the bottlenecks or create the impediments for them to look towards global markets?
Yeah, so I think when I'm answering this, it's important to, again, remember that we're talking about Etsy sellers, businesses of one. And so time is probably their most precious resource. So it's not I think it used to be entering into the global market. Now it's navigating it. And as a business of one, domestic sellers have to, or sellers located in the U.S. have to do this cost-benefit analysis. Do I have the time to understand what it takes to get my product from A to B if I'm engaging in that international shipping? And unfortunately, right now, a lot of our sellers do not. They opt not to do that, which is a huge missed opportunity. So when we're talking about trade, we see trade agreements or even the customs bill that passed in February, to answer your question, that increase the de minimis threshold for small value goods to pass across the border. The U.S. increased their de minimis threshold to $800, which is fantastic. But if you look at Canada, it's $20, and that's Canadian dollars, not U.S. dollars. So there's a huge disparity there. So I think one simple way would be to negotiate a universal de minimis threshold so that when you have micro businesses and small sellers, Etsy sellers, that's one way for them to simplify the transaction process.
Julie, I've heard you speak about the WTO trade facilitation agreement in the past. Is that something that you see as important to your sellers?
Well, I think just generally the forum itself, just the focus on SMEs, like you're seeing for the first time with TPP that you have this focus on small and medium-sized enterprises, but also the digital economy and how the economy is changing and how that intersects with trade. And so I haven't been to the meeting, so I don't want to say what's happening at the WTO, but from what we know and what we hear and report back, what is reported back is that there is a growing interest in how trade impacts SMEs, and that's fantastic news because in the past where an individual Etsy seller might not matter, when you take collectively 1.7 million Etsy sellers, they do. And the potential for increasing exports for the US and across the world, I think, is significant. So we're pleased that other forums and other places are taking a look at the importance of SMEs and acknowledging the potential there.
Well, I think we have about 5 minutes, and we could take a question, one question or maybe two questions. Okay, there's a gentleman back there. Could you please identify yourself?
Yes, I'm a member acting reporter with Bloomberg DNA. A question for Minister Suzuki. Would you comment on the next steps for ratification of TPP in Japan?
Well, currently our Prime Minister and our government is working really hard to pass the TPP bill at the Parliament, the Diet, and they are working very hard on that. I don't know what the newest news about it, but they are working hard in the lower house. And then I think that the ruling parties and government is trying to push the process forward and trying to pass the bill by the end of this year. Yes.
By the end of this year, that would mean it would have to go through both houses. Is that right?
Oh yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there another question? Doug? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Buchwald, a freshman at the GW School of Business. I have a question for Ambassador Vedder. You mentioned before that TPP would improve labor standards and environmental standards, and that also nutrition would be improved. But that being said, I know that production is usually outsourced because labor is cheaper. So wouldn't this increase prices?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean that it would increase prices for, but often for consumers, when businesses have the ability to source from multiple places, that can bring down prices for consumers. And when you look at, if you're talking about fruits and vegetables and increasing nutrition itself, if you look at the countries like Malaysia and Vietnam, who are growing in their numbers of middle-class folks, so they're changing their diets and how they eat, if that's what you're referencing. If you look at many of the countries in Southeast Asia, they are land poor. And so they're not in a position to domestically raise the protein that they need, or may have seasonal issues or climate issues with being able to really create a full diet. It may be more economically advantageous for them to specialize in the production of a few crops and import others. And so, our fruit and vegetable industry in the United States exports a lot of what they produce, and a lot of what they do is cross-seasonality. So if you think about the fact that you can eat pineapples and strawberries and grapes in January, that's in part because of the free trade agreement we negotiated with Chile, whose winter and summer are the opposite of ours. And we send the same products back and forth so that our producers and consumers then have markets year-round and have affordable product all year round. And both sets of producers actually do better because consumers have in the back of their head that any time of the year, I can get a quality strawberry. And so it becomes a more integrated part of their diet. And so trade has actually benefited producers in both countries and created new economic opportunity. And as for labor and outsourcing, that has been an issue. There are certain industries that, of course, have faced more global competition than others in this country, and we hear a lot about them. But we don't hear as much about the fact that manufacturing is actually coming back to the United States, or the fact that we manufacture more in the U.S. today than we did years ago. What has happened, of course, is that a lot of that manufacturing is very technologically advanced, and we make more things with fewer people. But it's also true that the U.S. manufacturing sector is very attractive to companies who need advanced manufacturing or are looking to manufacture precision goods. And they need a skilled workforce and a steady environment and that rule of law to create consistent product for some of these things. And so they look to countries like the United States to be able to manufacture that precision component or that high-value good. But then we need places to send them. So the more integrated we are in being able to have trade agreements with other countries, to pull in parts for those things to be assembled in a precision way, manufacturing does benefit from our access to those markets as well.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. I hate to say this. I hate to cut the discussion short, but in all fairness, we have a second panel, and Reed's going to introduce them. But before that, I want to thank my panel. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time. And by the way, we have a small token of appreciation, we being the Association of Women in International Trade, which we will give to you before you leave. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh. As you are going to your seat, I'll make a little program announcement. Here between panels, we have a brief presentation from Andrea Durkin. So, Andrea, why don't you make your way to the stage? Andrea Durkin is the principal of Sparkplug, and she is here to tell us about trade vistas. And so, I believe... Oh, sorry. It's already there.
So you just press it to advance.
At the big green one.
Got it. I can do that. Oh, well, thank you so much. Thanks to Evelyn at WIIT, and thank you so much to GW-CIBER for allowing me to kind of do this little commercial in between the panels. It's a new website dedicated to a dialogue on trade called Trade Vistas. And, we've had this discussion already just today about how much trade has been a target in this election cycle. I think the likes of which we really haven't seen since at least the 1992 presidential debate, when Ross Perot famously talked about the giant sucking sound that NAFTA would cause. And yet, Minister Suzuki said it, we're living in a bubble here in Washington on TPP, because polls show that over 70% of the general public either hasn't heard or isn't very familiar with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we think there's an obvious need for a constructive discourse on trade in the immediate term, but frankly, the need didn't begin, and it's not going to end with the presidential cycle in the United States. And the need to engage the general public on trade doesn't begin or end with a campaign around any particular trade agreement, whether it was NAFTA back then or whether it's TPP today. So we launched Trade Vistas to be a platform for inviting the general public in on the trade conversation. We want to be able to address issues and questions around trade policy in the most neutral and credible way we can, and we want to use it as a platform for generating new policy ideas and approaches, drawing on a whole variety of disciplines, whether for you guys here at GW, whether you come from a national security background, an international development background, or a business background, we think that everybody has a place in developing sort of the next generation of trade policy. So I want to quickly just show you the website itself. We've organized our content into 4 categories, and you're going to see that on the menu on the home page. And I'm going to take you into each of those pages and just very briefly describe what they do. So firstly, we have something called features. Features are articles. They're inspired by any trade and investment topic on which we hope to offer some unique insights and some new thinking on trade. And frankly, it's not just positioning this as experts telling you what to think. What we want to do is seek diverse perspectives and contributions to the site. So we're actively engaging the readers and asking you to submit questions and submit content. On another page, we have something called essentials. So essentials are short takes on key issues. They're sort of facts and backgrounds put into a current context. And the idea behind this is that we're creating a living and a growing library. Again, they're contributed by experts and presented in a neutral way, but they're inspired by questions from readers, and they're linked to articles where these topics are introduced. So if we talk about things like where we got our logo designed through the platform of 99 Designs, we're going to tell you that the Indonesian designer who submitted and won the contest actually engaged in a cross-border services transaction. And we're going to link that to an essential on services and tell our readers what that means so that they're in on the discussion about trade policy and its mechanics. We have another page called Journeys, and journeys are stories about people and products, services, and the ideas that they trade. My CSIS colleague once said, we think of trade today, it's sort of like fish swimming in water, right? We live it and we breathe it, but we don't know we're swimming in it. And the gentleman from the port talked about it. We go to Walmart and we think that all that stuff was actually made here, and what do we need a port for? So with Journeys, we're trying to bring the everyday to life. And so that we can appreciate the mechanics of trade and provide a stronger basis for understanding and evaluating trade policies. This is one of our stories on how U.S. potatoes are filling the craze, the honey butter chip craze in Seoul, Korea. So we're trying to tell these kind of stories. The last page we have is something called Tools, which is a collection of resources on trade. These are resources that we think are really fun and accessible to use. Generally, they're interactive, they're highly visual, they're way better than most of the government websites, although they leverage all the government data. It's official data, but it's presented in a way that I think is much more accessible to the general public. I teach at Georgetown, and my students started directing me to some of these, and I couldn't believe I didn't know about them for all the years I've been doing trade. And so we wanted to sort of crowdsource them and also curate them on this page. So in each of these categories, we're going to weave visuals and infographics to try to heighten interest and understanding, but also produce highly shareable content, what we hope will be highly shareable content. And we are asking, you'll see on each of these pages, if I were to scroll up, you'd see submit an idea on every single page. And back here on the home page, we're doing something called, we're doing polls. We're going to query readers about how they think about different aspects of trade in their lives, in their communities, and in their workplaces. And, we're going to reflect back the results of those things, and we're going to make sure that when we take readers' input that, you can see what questions they had and how we've tried to address them. So we're really trying to have it be a two-way street on this website. And we launched a few weeks ago here in Washington, but it's not just a national conversation. This is a global conversation. And it's not just a conversation among those of us who've been around trade policy for a number of years. It's really about bringing people who haven't been part of the conversation into it, and focusing on the generation who we think are going to iterate and innovate trade policy, and for whom the benefits of trade seem very evident in their own daily lives. And I'm speaking, frankly, about millennials, because the polls, show that millennials are really bullish on trade. So about 70% think trade is good for our country, but they also think it's good and it benefits them in their own lives. And I haven't seen similar surveys globally, but I would wager that it's probably quite similar in other countries in the way that millennials think about trade in their lives. So we're going to do something different. We're going to invite what I think are the next generation of trade policymakers to serve as our advisors in our advisory board. These are young trade professionals and students, much like many of you in the room. And I expect that they're going to tell us what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong about the site and how we can more effectively engage the generation that I think are poised to be the most supportive yet of international trade. And, you know, we don't want to push this generation into what I was pushed into, which was thinking about the giant sucking sound. We want to encourage, you know, and foment kind of the positive thinking that they're already disposed to today. So I hope that you'll visit the site, that you'll bookmark the page, but more importantly, that you'll sign up to receive updates and you'll share the site on social media. And probably most of all, we really are sincere about engaging you about your ideas. So if you have a story that you want others to read about in Journeys, share that with us. If you have a valuable resource that you want us to post on Tools, send that in. We have something on the homepage called Cargo Shorts, which are data points that are shareable data points. So please send us your thoughts and ideas. Sign up, let us know how we can get better, and join the conversation about trade vistas. So thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to do the commercial.
Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to invite the members of the next panel to join me on stage and take their seats. This panel will address what needs to change. I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator for the panel, Kathryn Hauser. She is Vice President of the Washington campus and Managing Partner of the External Affairs consulting firm Policy Connections International. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Hauser.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second panel. We're going to be building on the discussion we just heard about why trade is so important to the U.S. economy and the global economy, but delve down a little bit more into the reasons why we have so much angst about this subject, particularly as it concerns displaced workers. In thinking about how to put together this panel in cooperation with Evelyn Suarez, we thought it would be very helpful to bring in a senior person from the Department of Labor, and we have Gerri Fiala with us, to discuss the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which has been the main way the U.S. government and Congress have chosen to help workers who've been displaced by trade. That program was first started in 1962, so indeed, this issue is not a new one that has just come up. Then we're going to turn to Simon Marti from the Swiss Embassy, because as many of you may know, Switzerland has been at the vanguard in developing credible public-private partnerships in their effort to bring together apprentice programs with employers. And this is a subject that is frequently discussed and pointed to as a way the U.S. might be able to expand our trade adjustment assistance. Then we will hear from Professor Wayne Talley of Old Dominion University down in Southern Virginia. He has done some innovative work, again, in a different flavor of a public-private partnership in bringing together the university, the port, and major employers to develop a graduate-level program to help people better understand the critical jobs that are needed in the issue of maritime. And finally, we'll conclude with our colleague from Toyota USA. I'm so sorry, Robert, your name just went out of my head. Robert is with Toyota USA, and I thought it would be very interesting for you in the audience to hear of a foreign invested company that has come here to the United States to build cars, as Ambassador Suzuki mentioned, but it does so because the U.S. does have a very highly skilled workforce, and they are working cooperatively to try and advance the education of their workers. What I would like to do is have each of our panelists make a few opening comments, and then we'll engage in a conversation among our panelists, because I think that's where the greatest learning takes place, when people can have a dialogue. And then at the end, we'll leave time for questions from you. So with that, let me turn to Ms. Fiala and welcome you. Thank you very much for being with us. And tell us, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program seems to get a lot of attention, but only 50,000 people have actively been taking part in the program. Where do you see the program moving ahead for changes? Could you talk a little bit about the program as it stands now and how you see it changing?
Thank you for the opportunity. I want to refer back, I think, a little bit to the ambassador's remarks. There are tremendous benefits to trade and for the consumers. Mm-hmm. Some of those benefits are very diffuse, but there are also costs to trade. And one very important one, which may be targeted to particular industries and particular regions of the country, there is a cost there. And mm-hmm. trade adjustment assistance for workers is a very important program and service to help these workers regain employment and return, hopefully, to the middle class. The department administers a number of programs that help displaced workers receive training and find employment under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And much of this funding is formula funding to states and local areas, which in turn provides services through nearly 2,500 American job centers around the country. And anyone who needs help can walk into any one of those centers where various public and private organizations work together in partnership to provide one-stop services to individuals, including dislocated workers and trade-impacted workers. The Trade Adjustment Assistance Program is a mandated partner in that particular program. And what it does is it provides an opportunity for workers who are given a pink slip or who are notified that their jobs may be impacted by trade, that they can rapidly learn about information and services and benefits that can be provided to them. You mentioned some numbers. Over the past 5 years, nearly 250,000 trade-affected workers have participated in the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, and about almost 230,000 of those workers have gotten back to work. The entered employment rate last year for workers was about 74%, and once they get jobs, because they were experienced workers with work histories, they retain their employment. And I believe last year it was a little bit over 90% of those who had become employed had been able to retain their jobs. And that is incredibly important. The Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, once workers are determined eligible for that program, it's a very robust program, and it provides both reassessment services, reemployment services, including assessment services, to determine for these workers, how can I use the skills that I have? What do I need to upgrade to fill some gaps or deal with rusty skills to be able to qualify for the jobs that are available? It provides a very robust training program with income support while these workers are in training. And we'll hear about registered apprenticeship, which is a very important approach to training, very structured, very successful. And the United States, we're working very hard to expand that registered apprenticeship with to other industries and occupations. But the training that can be provided under trade adjustment assistance includes not only registered apprenticeship, but on-the-job training where employers hire people they may not have hired because they didn't have quite all the skills match, and train them on the job. It includes classroom training. It includes remedial education where somebody may not have the numeracy or the reading skills that they need. And it also includes services that involve relocation and out-of-area job search. Two services that are not used very much because the typical trade adjustment assistance worker last year was 50 years old and male and had had about 11 years of tenure in the particular job and had graduated from high school and may have had some college, but clearly is, and may have had the best job in their community.
Wow.
And they're now faced with having to learn skills for a new occupation in a new industry. And that is a very challenging thing to do, which is why this program was reauthorized last year and the eligibility for it was expanded. And we are expecting to have about a little over 100,000 workers qualify for it in this fiscal year. So I want you to think about that process and put yourself in the place of workers who need to be able to change over time and to do that in a way where they're still paying a mortgage, they're still putting their children probably through school. They're not going to necessarily pick up and move easily from their communities. So these are the reasons why trade adjustment assistance for workers and another part of the program, we don't have a representative here from the Commerce Department today, but trade adjustment assistance for firms are increasingly important to communities and individuals.
Thank you, Gerri. I think you really put a personal face on trade adjustment assistance, which is a program that those of us who've been doing trade policy forever don't often think about, the 50-year-old white guy with a high school education who takes advantage of your program. I really appreciate you bringing out those stories. I think that helps us understand why the focus that we often think about, well, let's just have more apprenticeship programs, building on Germany and Switzerland and others, may not be the full story that we need. So let's turn to Simon Marti from Switzerland. Tell us about the success that you've had in Switzerland with your apprentice programs and so forth.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Before I start to talk about the Swiss CT, Career and Technical Education System, I'm very interested to know, did anyone hear about our CT system before? Very interesting. Could someone say, like, in which respect? Maybe you?
Yeah, I believe that the embassy had something a year or two ago.
Okay. Okay, very nice. Okay. So, as most don't have a lot of knowledge about this, I think it would be great, like, to go into some key features, like main features that make it successful. One is it is really a public-private partnership, meaning that the private sector works together with the federal level. Switzerland is also a federalist country, similar as the United States, with the federal level, but also with the cantons, which is the same as the states here. This means that each actor has its own tasks in this system, but also share the funding. The system is rather expensive. It costs 9 billion Swiss francs, which is currently the same in US dollars. And the the large part of it, like 60%, are paid for by the private sector, and the other 40% are paid by the federal level and the cantonal state level, basically. So it works like that. Our motto is earn while you learn. So it's tuition free. It's like the school part. It's dual, which means there is a practical part where apprentices, CT students, work in a workplace environment at the company. And at the same time, they go to school like 1 or 2 days a week. And the school is paid for by the cantons, by the state. They get a salary paid for by the private sector, by the companies that employ them. And the second important feature, I think, is permeability, which is very important for the positive image of the system. Permeability, I mean permeability within the overall education system. So it's very important to understand the Swiss CT system is an integral part of the overall education system, where you can change your pathway. For instance, I myself did also start out with a CT education, with an apprenticeship. So I'm a trained lab technician in chemistry. Later on, I changed and studied political science at the university. So you can still change, you don't lose time. For instance, I think this is a very important thing and very necessary also in Switzerland, as apprentices start very early. Typically you start an apprenticeship in Switzerland at age 15, 16. It takes 3 or 4 years. It's a very broad program. So, for instance, we have 230 different apprenticeships spanning like the whole range where you can imagine, like from nursing to mechanics to lab technicians to commerce to retail, everything basically. So, but still, every apprenticeship curriculum is still very broad. Like, it's not just, we wouldn't have, for instance, an apprenticeship as a welder. Welding would be like a small part of the curriculum of a mechanic, for instance. So I think this, just to go back a little bit to trade, like, I mean, if a company might close down, which would have employed welders, those mechanics would still be able to find another job in a similar, probably not in welding, but in a different specialization which was also covered during their apprenticeship. So they have a much broader, we say that like a backpack, in terms of how they're educated. So this permeability, I think, is very important for parents and for youngsters to decide when they decide to enter an apprenticeship. About 70% of age cohort do an apprenticeship in Switzerland, and the rest they go to a more academic track already at the beginning. But the ones who go to apprenticeship, I mean, there is no inferiority about it. It's some people really like to do their work afterwards, after the apprenticeship, and stay. Most do that. And but if you would like to go to look for another pathway, you always have the chance, and I think that's very important. So, and the third feature, also very important, is the system is very labor market oriented. So students would have to apply with companies for an apprenticeship position. The companies can choose their own apprentices. So it's a market. Currently, the market is very good for students because there are more offers of apprenticeship positions than there are students, because the age cohorts fluctuate like every year. It's different. And about 40% of the companies in Switzerland participate in the system. So, so you see, like, they would not offer apprenticeship positions if they weren't jobs available afterwards, and they would retain them. It's really an integral part of their HR strategy. Like, they would employ apprentices, and they would train them, and they would retain most of them in many cases.
Fascinating.
So,
I think
thank you.
it's very important to bring out the fact that there's no stigma attached to
No,
being
there is no.
an apprentice and going through that process in Switzerland, where here in the U.S. there's been such a disinvestment in vocational education in the 80s and 90s that love your comments on that, Gerri.
Well, I think, you know, in the States, parents aspire to have all of their children go to college. And that's not necessarily what a child wants to do. They're certainly incredibly important, well-paying technical occupations in this country that do not necessarily require a college degree, but certainly require advanced training. And frankly, because apprenticeship, as described, includes both an academic or theoretical component and a practical or work component, that when they're integrated and combined, allows a young person or to be able to acquire college credit for their academic part, as well as then they're being employed and earning a wage. And in fact, the Department of Labor with the Department of Education has, in partnership, has a program with community colleges and apprenticeship programs and third-party reviewers right now, such that if people complete these programs that are part of the investment, they can earn college credit while they become an apprentice. And guess what? There's no debt for that particular program. Not only are they earning college credit and getting college experience, but they're also working in their apprenticeship.
Learning while they earn.
It's how do we help parents and guidance teachers and students better understand this important opportunity.
Thank you for that. One little question following up. How does Switzerland handle the 50-year-old person who's displaced in a job? If he had been through an apprentice program 30 years before, what happens to him now?
It's still possible to do an adult apprenticeship. I mean, I have to add, like usually the normal case, it's a youth apprenticeship, what we have. But about slightly more than 10% of the apprenticeship of the CT diplomas every year are adult apprenticeships. So many would move on to the field of nursing because there is a lot of demand currently. Like we're also an aging society, so that there are shifts. It's not just trade.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Thank you for that. Let's turn to Professor Wayne Talley, who's done work more at the university and graduate school level. Please tell us what your perspectives are on this topic.
Okay. One of the few universities in the U.S. that has maritime education. And the question is, what is maritime education? Well, economics, the two pillars are micro and macro. In maritime, the two pillars are ports and shipping. We speak of trade, but the question comes up, how do we get that cargo to the final destination? And that turns out to be a rather complex issue. You have to be familiar with the type of shipping line you need to use. Today, most of our manufactured cargo will move in containers, but there are other types of ships moving petroleum and so on. But we learned that shippers have a very difficult time. This is the first time I've shipped cargo abroad. What do I need to know about this? Well, it turns out it's rather complex. Not only is there customs, you have to understand in your country, customs in a foreign country. Also, you have to deal with the port, getting your cargo to the port. So who do we turn to? many of our shippers that are not very knowledgeable in moving cargo abroad will turn to a freight forwarder, and that's a shipper broker. There's also a 3PL, third-party logistics shipper broker. And the difference between the two is that a freight forwarder doesn't have warehouses or trucks to help you move your cargo to the port. The 3PL does. Mm-hmm. And to be licensed as the shipper brokers, you have to pass a test. Other issues come up again is in choosing the shipping line. In our local area, we have the international headquarters of Dollar Tree. And a number of our students work for Dollar Tree as logistics analysts. In Dollar Tree, I've had Dollar Tree come to my classes and talk about the problems they have in importing cargo. There are certain shipping lines that do a better job in moving their cargo from, say, Shanghai to Norfolk, and others not so good. So they will tell their people, we will only use these particular shipping lines. Also, there's a problem of getting the cargo, say, in China from the manufactory to the port. Then the question comes up, which port do you choose? Do you choose Shanghai or Dalian or Ningbo? Which one do you choose? Then you need help at that end with the language. That's the difficulty. You need to pass all the documents, or have all the documents signed that allow for that cargo to leave China. So you have to meet the requirements of their customs. Then you have to be concerned, once the cargo gets to our port of Virginia, will our customs accept that cargo? Maybe or maybe not. But if you use a third party as a freight forwarder or a 3PL, they've done this so much, they should be able to give you good advice on that. There are many, many issues here. For example, for cargo to enter the port of Virginia, most people don't know that the pilot of that ship has to turn over that wheel to a harbor pilot. And a harbor pilot is one that knows the natural depths of the harbor and so forth. Also, we need tugs. Bring that ship in. Of course, I mentioned customs. Some other issues I can mention here are the ship brokers. Suppose the ship has a problem at the harbor, in the harbor, but the shipping line doesn't have an office there. Then they use a ship agent. So our students are abreast in all these details, but also we bring in supply chain management. And supply chain management looks at interplay between all parties. And I should say that in the U.S., we have two programs that are unique, not taught elsewhere in the U.S. In 2006, we started an undergraduate degree in maritime and supply chain management. And today we have 100 students. And our students get jobs. Recently, we started our new master's degree, Master of Science in Maritime Trade and Supply Chain Management. That degree is also unique in the U.S. To my knowledge, it's unique in the world. I'm affiliated with several universities around the world. It's honorary professor, like in Shanghai Maritime, National Chiao Tung University in Taipei, and also Ningbo, but also City University in London. And so this maritime area, I should say, thought came to mind. There's no PhD program in the U.S. in maritime business. And there are only a few universities in the world that offer such a program. That's University of Antwerp in Belgium, and Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and a few in China, Shanghai, and Dalian. So let me stop here. I can talk about this for a long time, as you can tell. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think many of us in the trade world who have worked on customs issues are somewhat familiar, but it's great that you could go through and demonstrate just how complex the whole process is of shipping and working in the ports. I think that's a very helpful thing to be reminded of. Now let's turn to Toyota North America with Robert Chiappetta, who's going to talk a little bit about what a major foreign investor has done in the U.S. In terms of training. Please.
So thank you. Thank you for including me on this panel. It's an honor to be on the stage with you all. So Toyota, as you probably know, manufactures and sells cars here in the United States. Perhaps some of you have driven our product. What you might not know is that about 70% of what we sell here in the U.S., we manufacture here as well. And so we have 10 plants in 9 different states. We produce 10 models here in the U.S. And in addition, we're starting to export those products from the U.S. as well. And so last year in 2015, we exported about 150,000 units from the U.S. to about 40 different countries. So when we look at trade and trade agreements for Toyota, it's a rather complicated equation that we undertake, because it's not only what's coming into this country, but it's also what we might be able to export from here as well. So with 10 plants in 9 different states, you might imagine that our workforce needs are rather significant, and indeed they are. And like most manufacturers in the United States, we struggle to find the right mix of talent. In specific areas in particular, there's a shortfall of talent. And it's referred to by most as a skills gap that exists here in the United States. And to deal with that issue, to confront that issue, Toyota has essentially rolled up its sleeves and partnered with educational organizations across the country to initiate programs that train workers that are eligible for the jobs that we need filled. And so Toyota now currently has 2 signature programs, one on the manufacturing side that trains technicians to repair robots and machinery on the shop floor. We call that the Advanced Manufacturing Technicians Program. We partner with about 13 different schools in about 9 different states on that project. And we have another separate training program that is in partnership with our dealerships, and that trains technicians for dealers to repair and maintain our cars. And so that program is an older program. It's existed for quite some time. And it partners with about 40 plus different schools across the country. So when you add that all together, we partner with about 50 different community colleges and other educational organizations, and we graduate about 600 students per year that are hired directly by Toyota or by our dealers. And so the investment that we've made in the career and technical education areas is quite extensive, and is part of what we need to do in order to take advantage of these kinds of trade agreements and to remain competitive in a global environment.
Robert, may I ask you, when you say that Toyota is experiencing a skills gap here in the U.S., building on what Simon was saying, is your problem that you can't find skilled welders, or you can't find skilled mechanically trained people? The distinction being the very narrow or the broader training.
So we prefer to have someone with a very broad training. What's a little bit unique about our manufacturing program is that it seeks to create what we refer to as a multi-skilled technician. Mm-hmm. So this is someone who can do about 3 or 4 or maybe more different types of skilled activities. For us on the shop floor, if your robot or machine has gone down, there may be 2 or 3 different processes that you have to deal with at one time in order to repair that machine. And so we need someone who has the ability to do multiple tasks. That's difficult to find. A person like that is very difficult to find. And so what we did when we partnered with the educational organizations that we've teamed up with is not necessarily to tell them, we need you to graduate more electrical technicians or welders. What we did is we said, here's what an applicant applying for a Toyota job should look like. These are the skills that they should have. Mm-hmm. And in order to create that kind of candidate, here are a series of courses you should consider putting together as a program for that student. And so it was a very involved conversation that we had with our education partners to help them understand what it is that we need. Mm-hmm. And I think if we think about trade policy and where we have fallen short a little bit, it is and maybe this contrasts a little bit with what's happening in Switzerland, is that we have not done as good a job maintaining that connection between employer and education community. Mm-hmm. And if we redouble our efforts on that front, I think parents, the average American and voters wouldn't have as much angst about trade because they would feel as though the system that's in place is preparing them and their children for what these trade opportunities create.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Gerri, you want to come in on that point?
I'd love to. When I first mentioned the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which is sort of the foundation, if you will, for the public workforce system, it was the first major reform of the public workforce system in 15 years, and states and local areas are implementing it now, and at the federal level, it is being implemented in a partnership between the Departments of Labor and Education and other federal agencies. And it's really based upon a job-driven training strategy focus, if you will, which means deepening the relationships between employers and training and education providers. And that is absolutely essential moving forward, not only for the success of the public workforce system, but all of the partner programs, including trade adjustment assistance and programs for young people who are disconnected from education or work, or adults, or other displaced workers who were displaced but not by global trade. Right. So I think that is a very important message and something that we are looking forward to. And in each state and in each local area within the state, there are boards that are led by business and at the local level with a majority of business members. And the whole approach is to make sure that federal investments going down and services delivered through those American job centers are addressing the needs of 2 customers, the job seeker and worker, and that of the employer who needs skilled workers to compete successfully. So that's the premise behind what's happening.
Excellent. Go ahead. I'm
well,
sorry.
I would just add, I couldn't agree more with what was just said, and really to applaud the Department of Labor for moving in this direction. When the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was before Congress a few years ago, Toyota and a lot of other businesses were there advocating for these kinds of changes.
Very supportive.
Yeah, we're really pleased to see that kind of outcome. On the workforce board front that was just mentioned, we've sought to take direct advantage of that, not for ourselves necessarily, but for the benefit of the manufacturing community in the states where we operate. And so we have representatives now on 3 state workforce boards, and it's an opportunity for us to extend our thinking to the entire state. Because our industry is a very supply chain driven industry, and so it's not just about our workers and whether or not we have enough for the jobs that we are responsible for, but also our suppliers. What you'll find happen in this situation a lot is a manufacturer like Toyota, because of our size, because of our reputation, because of the types of opportunities we provide, it's easy for us to poach talent further down the supply chain. But we don't want to be doing that because
at some cost.
Yeah, because it hurts us in the end. And so, helping create a system that is more broad-based, that's benefiting more, benefiting the region more broadly, is extremely important in order for us to succeed in this area.
Right. And I would use the term sectors. I mean, you're talking about an advanced manufacturing sector, but there's the healthcare sector, and there's IT, and there's other sectors, and all of these really are under the purview of the strategic thinking of those boards.
I think it's interesting, Robert, that you brought out that your work also encompasses technicians who work in dealerships. So even though you don't have manufacturing facilities in all 50 states, you certainly have dealers in all 50 states. And so the ripple effect of what you're getting, the payback from the investment you're making is huge. And it's neat to see that they're more on the service side of the economy. That's very interesting. Because I think we only think of trade adjustment assistance and workforce training as being in manufacturing.
And that is really no longer, has not been and is not the case. And even in apprenticeship, and there were several Swiss companies in the finance area and insurance area that were here not too long ago. Because there are global companies, we are having conversations about expanding apprenticeships and having employers take the lead in these other industries. There's apprenticeships that are being developed in finance and in insurance, as well as healthcare for registered nurses and health technicians. So, I mean, it really is an employer-driven approach, but it benefits everyone, and it certainly benefits communities.
What suggestions do any of you have for how we better publicize the partnerships that exist between the Department of Labor and companies, universities, and others, that the sense that we really are making progress and moving forward and with great success for companies and employers? How do we get that word out more broadly that will help change the tenor of the discussion on trade?
So it is a massive task, and there are a lot of minds to change, I think. But in the communities where we operate, one of the things that we've done is to transform how we use visitor centers. So if you visit a Toyota plant, you can make an appointment and get a tour of our facility. And what those visitor centers were used for a long time was simply to accommodate the interest that was present in the community to see what was kind of going on behind the big four walls of our facility. What we've done is we've flipped that a little bit, and now we're proactively seeking audiences to come in and see what we're doing. And so we're reaching out to middle schools, and we're bringing in students so that they can see firsthand what a manufacturing setting is like. It's not the perhaps dirty or dark image that they may have of manufacturing. It's actually a very high-tech, very complicated process. And for a young person to see that firsthand early on is a way to open up an opportunity, open up an understanding of a career pathway that might apply to them. It's kind of one-on-one, hand-to-hand combat, so to speak, and it takes really everybody's involvement to try and change perceptions. But that's one way to approach it.
Mm-hmm. I'm only smiling because I was in Germany last week looking at career and technical education programs, and I ended up in a Hochschule, and they were doing career exploration of younger students. And in one particular program, they literally spend a day in a company with a particular occupation or broad set of occupations and work in teams to do something. So there's a very real world touch to the career exploration. I brought back my plastic spoons that they made for me. The idea that they had a team to do the design work and a team to calibrate the measurements on the machine and another team to figure out the dyes for the plastic and another team to cost it out. This was all done in one day. As part of a very in-depth career exploration program. So one of the things we do need to think about in this country is we have not for a long time figured out a way to have robust career exploration and to sort of invest in real-time labor market. I would dare say for students as well as teachers. So that they understand what's happening in the labor market. And you asked early on sort of advice, with regard to trade. I think in this country, the robust funding to be able to expand services to there are waiting lines of people who need service.
Yes, I noticed that you flinched when Simon said your budget's $9 billion in Switzerland.
But I do think that we have to give consideration of that if we're going to embrace change and help individuals and communities be able to grow as we move forward in a global economy.
Great.
Private sector and public sector combined.
Yes.
So, and I have to add, the private sector actually makes a net profit out of it because the apprentices, it's actual work on the job, like it's in the workplace, in a workplace environment with a trainer, but like probably not in a first year apprentice, but maybe for sure a third year apprentice is actually rather productive. So there you see an important incentive for companies to participate, and I think that's why we have 40% of all companies in Switzerland, which would potentially be eligible to participating in the system.
Great.
I think that might be that might play a certain role, but I also think it's a cultural thing also, that the companies, they look ahead, they know that they will need a skilled workforce. And I think it's in the DNA somewhere.
Excellent.
Well, I was impressed with how the professor described his program. I think it showed a lot of effort in connecting to the business that he was trying to serve, that you're trying to serve. And I think I don't know that your counterparts are doing that as much as you seem to be doing that. I mean, I think it is incumbent upon business to reach out to the education community and tell and help show or demonstrate to the education community what it is that we need. But the education community has to be open to that kind of input. It's not about just simply educating for the sake of education. There has to be that stronger connection to where it's leading to, what kind of job opportunity is it creating. And I think the program you described showed a lot of connection in that way.
Very good. Shall we open it up for questions while we have a few minutes remaining before the reception? I hate to stand between you and a glass of wine, but let's take a question or two. Yes. Here comes the mic.
Thank you. Great panel. Thanks very much. I'm Joanne Thornton. I work at Policy Connections International. And I wanted to go back to the question of the $9 billion, because I was struck by that too. I saw Gerri, because Gerri, tell me if I'm wrong, but that's about 10 times the amount of money that goes through trade adjustment assistance in a single year. Maybe it's $700 to $800 million.
Well, trade adjustment assistance, it's about 400 some million.
Oh, even less. So my question is,
excuse me. Let me introduce Norris Tyler, who's the director for the Office of Trade Adjustment Assistance, who's trying to tell me how much money we have.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It was like 10 times larger in Switzerland for much smaller. And so I was wondering how this is funded. Are the companies that participate in the program, is there sort of a fee that they pay, or does this come out of the general treasury like it does here?
It is not. One thing is very important. It is not part of a trade assistant adjustment scheme. It is part of our education system.
Yes.
So,
that's a big distinction.
And how it's funded, it's like 60% of those 9 billion Swiss francs a year come from the companies who hire, or not hire, who hired the apprentices basically and train the apprentices. So what happens is a young student, an apprentice, enters in a contract with a company at age 15, 16, a 3 or 4 year contract, depending which apprenticeship it is. And half of those 60%, the company or the private sector in Switzerland contribute to the system, are basically salaries for those apprentices. So an apprentice would typically earn a salary. It really depends which apprenticeship we talk about. Let's say between $500 and $1,000 a month in the first year, and this would raise until the third or fourth year. So it's the companies who pay, the private sector that pay a lot. This is 60%, and as I mentioned earlier, the companies actually make profit out of it because a small profit. It's maybe like temporary. Yeah, if they pay 5.5 billion, maybe they get almost 6 maybe out of it.
And the rest of the funding comes from the canton or the
schools,
state level.
Exactly, the schools are free, so neither the apprentices nor the companies would have to pay tuition. So those are cantonal schools, like cantons, the same as states here, and these schools, the teachers' salaries, they are paid for by the cantons, and certain parts of it, like bridge year solutions, for instance, for young students who are still not decided like which field to go, are funded by the federal level. So, like of those, of the component of the 40% funded by the public sector, by the public entities, 3/4 are from the states, from the cantons, and 1/4 is from the federal level, from the federal government.
I hate to stand between you and that drink, but let me just clarify very quickly. When I was listing the different types of training under trade adjustment assistance, any registered apprenticeship program is also in the United States going to have a contribution by an employer, as well as the federal dollar can pick up the academic conceptual part at an institution. so that we have that too. Employers are agreeing to hire the apprentice, and they are training under a master trainer. It's a structured training program, but the public workforce dollars can pay for the academic part of that. They can pay for other pieces of it. Under the new reform legislation, actually apprenticeship has been expanded as part of that legislation, but there is still the same private sector investment in that individual who's being an apprentice, being trained as an apprentice, as well as the public. So it's a public-private partnership.
Robert, did you want to jump in?
Well, I'll add maybe one last thing, and that is the federal program that maybe is most similar to the program you described in the United States is actually the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act and the funding that comes out of there, which is about, I believe, about $1.2 billion, which still doesn't quite match up to what you've described. But they're in maybe different pockets. The trade adjustment assistance is linked very directly with trade,
right.
And part of the reason why we're having a discussion about that here today. But Perkins CTE funding is yet another very, very important, very critical program in the United States. In fact, it's up for reauthorization currently, and that's another issue we've been very active on trying to advance. And we'd like to see it not only reauthorized but improved upon, much the way the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was improved, so that business and the education systems become more connected, more working in unison. And so there are other programs that perhaps the trade community should be more familiar with in terms of how they can be utilized to promote the advantages of trade.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. We'll leave it on that rather positive note. Oh, I'm sorry.
I will leave the audience one statistic. This is from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Over 80% of all international trade moves by water. In fact, they refer to it as seaborne trade. Also, I'd like to mention that the first global industry in the world was maritime. And it goes back to the Phoenicians. But for some reason, we have not sought to develop this as a business area. And I encourage the special academic friends here to maybe talk about this in their universities.
Great. Well, thank you. I know Reed is here to close us off, but I just want to thank the panel very much for the conversation. I hope we've left things on a little more positive note than the first panel and the difficult issues that we're having about trade. But I think there's a lot of hope now.
Join me in thanking the members of the second.
Thank you.
And then finally, on behalf of the GW-CIBER, I want to thank you all for attending today's forum, a global trade agenda for the 45th president. Perhaps you have heard there is a reception shortly. But before we adjourn, I want to take a moment to thank our organizers and sponsors. This event was made possible by support from the Association of Women in International Trade, the District Export Council of Virginia and the District of Columbia, and the Wine Institute. So thank you all very much.